All right, listener, you're in for a real treat today because we are going deep into rule consequentialism.
That's right. It's a theory that really tries to get at some big questions about right and wrong. This kind of fundamental ethical dilemmas.
Exactly. And you've given us some pretty intense philosophical material to work with here. These excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on rule consequentialism.
Yeah, it's some dense stuff, but we're going to break it all down.
Yeah, consider this your philosopher's cheat sheet to rule consequentialism.
I like that.
So before we get into all the rules and all that we need to set the stage right, we're talking about consequentialism,
Right.
which is this idea that an action is moral or immoral based on its outcomes.
The ends justify the means.
Basically, yeah, the ends justify the means.
And I think a lot of people, when they hear consequentialism, they immediately jump to utilitarianism, like the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
Right.
And utilitarianism is definitely a type of consequentialism, but it's not the whole story.
All right, so utilitarianism is like one flavor of consequentialism.
Exactly.
But there are other types of consequentialism that say, well, hold on, there might be more to a good outcome than just happiness.
That's right.
Okay, so like what if an action makes a lot of people happy, but it does so in a way that's really unfair or unjust?
That's the dilemma.
Yeah. Would we really say that that's a morally good outcome?
That's the question. And that's where you get other consequentialists who say, alongside happiness, we also need to think about things like fairness and justice and equality.
Okay, so it's not just about how much good there is,
Right.
but also how that good is spread around.
The distribution of the good. Exactly.
Right.
So, maybe it's not ideal to have a world where a few people are like super happy and everyone else is miserable.
Right, even if that adds up to like the most total happiness.
Even if the total units of happiness are higher, right?
Right.
Exactly. And there's this idea in economics called diminishing marginal utility, which basically means the more you have of something, the less each additional unit matters to you.
Okay, that makes
So,
sense.
like, giving a billionaire another $1 million probably won't change their life that much.
Right, they're not going to be like, oh my God, another million.
Right, exactly. But giving that $1 million to a family that's struggling to put food on the table,
That's life-changing.
that's huge.
Right.
So the argument is that if you take resources from people who have a lot and give them to people who have very little, you might actually create more overall happiness.
Oh, that's fascinating because it's almost like a built-in argument for redistribution of wealth.
It is.
Yeah, based on this idea that happiness kind of levels off at some point.
Exactly. It's like
Yeah.
the more you have, the less each additional bit matters.
I like that. Okay, so we're moving beyond just pure happiness then.
We are.
How do we even define like well-being or welfare in these other types of consequentialism,
Yeah, that's a great question.
besides just like pure units of happiness?
Well, I think the classic starting point is this idea called hedonism.
Which basically says that pleasure is the ultimate good and pain is the ultimate bad.
Okay, so like maximize pleasure, minimize pain.
Exactly, but even hedonists argue about how to measure and compare different types of pleasure.
Right. Because is like a simple pleasure the same as like a really complex intellectual pleasure?
Right.
Is there a hierarchy of pleasures?
Exactly, and then some philosophers go even further and say, well, is pleasure really all there is to a good life?
Yeah.
Like, what about achieving goals or having meaningful relationships or, pursuing knowledge?
Right.
These things might not always feel pleasurable in the moment,
Right.
but they seem to contribute to a flourishing life.
Right. They seem important.
Yeah, and that's where you get this other theory called desire fulfillment theory,
Okay.
which basically says that fulfilling your desires, no matter what they are, contributes to well-being.
Okay, so wait. If my like deepest desire is to count every blade of grass in my backyard,
Okay,
does fulfilling that very strange desire
right.
actually make my life better? That's one of the challenges of this theory.
Yeah,
Is any desire, no matter how trivial or weird, does it really count?
yeah.
Or are some desires more important for a truly good life?
Yeah, I mean, some desires seem more like whims or something.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting because then philosophers start to debate about, okay, well, which desires are truly fulfilling
Right.
and how do they relate to overall good?
Okay, so just to recap, we have consequentialism, which is this general framework.
Yeah,
It's all about judging actions by their outcomes.
right.
We have utilitarianism, which is a specific type of consequentialism that's all about maximizing happiness.
Right.
And then we have these other types of consequentialism
Right.
that bring in other values like fairness and equality.
Right.
Now, where does rule consequentialism fit into all of this?
Yes, the star of the show.
Here we go.
So rule consequentialism takes this idea of maximizing good outcomes, and it adds a really crucial layer. It adds rules.
Rules. So instead of looking at each individual action and saying, is this good or bad? Based on the consequences, we're now talking about having rules that if everyone followed them would lead to the best outcomes.
Precisely.
Okay, so it's kind of like a zooming out
It is a zooming out.
from individual actions to like a societal level set of rules.
Exactly. It's like saying, instead of trying to figure out the best thing to do in every single moment, let's just come up with a set of rules that if everyone followed them would create the most good for everyone.
Okay, I like that. That's a really interesting shift.
It is.
Why the emphasis on rules wouldn't be more, well, consequentialist
Right.
to just focus on maximizing good in each specific action.
That's a question a lot of people ask, and it gets to the heart of the debate between act consequentialism,
Okay.
which judges each act on its own,
Okay.
and rule consequentialism. But even many act consequentialists admit that following rules is often the most practical way to make moral decisions in the real world.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued. Why is that?
Well, think about it. We rarely have perfect information when we're making decisions.
Right. We don't know the future.
Exactly. We're often making decisions with limited knowledge and unpredictable outcomes.
Right. It's not like we have a crystal ball.
We don't have a crystal ball.
Yeah, that would make things so much easier.
Exactly. And plus, imagine trying to calculate all the potential consequences, good and bad, of every little decision you make throughout the day.
I'd be exhausted.
It would be exhausting. We'd be paralyzed by indecision.
Yeah.
And here's another point. Imagine a world where everyone was constantly trying to maximize the good on a case-by-case basis, regardless of any rules.
Okay.
Would you trust anyone in that world?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't think I would, because it seems like promises wouldn't really mean anything.
Exactly.
Like agreements could be broken whenever it was convenient.
Right.
And you just never know what anyone's going to do.
Exactly. And that's one of the potential problems that rule consequentialism is trying to address. It says that having rules, even if they don't lead to the absolute best outcome in every single instance, is essential for creating a stable, predictable, trustworthy society.
Okay, so it's like you're saying it's about finding the right balance between trying to get the best outcome and making sure that people can actually like function in the society together.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance.
Yeah, like a compromise between flexibility and consistency.
You could say that, yeah, and rule consequentialists argue that this focus on rules actually leads to better outcomes in the long run.
Really?
Because when people know what to expect from each other,
Right.
when they can trust that others will generally follow the rules, it creates a more cooperative, productive, and ultimately happier society.
Okay. I'm starting to see the appeal of rules here.
Yeah.
But before we go any further, I want to clarify something. You keep saying rule consequentialism.
Right.
But I've also heard this term act consequentialism.
Mm.
What's the difference?
That's a key distinction.
Okay.
So act consequentialism says that we should judge each individual action by its consequences,
Okay.
while rule consequentialism focuses on following rules that would lead to the best consequences if generally accepted.
Okay, so act consequentialism is very much in the moment.
In the moment.
What's the outcome of this specific action?
Exactly.
Whereas rule consequentialism is more like, what are the long-term outcomes of this set of rules that we're going to follow?
Exactly. It's like the difference between trying to win every single hand in a card game versus trying to develop a winning strategy for the entire game.
Oh, I like that. That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
But doesn't that create a problem? If we're so focused on sticking to the rules, doesn't that mean we're sometimes going to end up doing things that don't actually maximize good in that specific situation?
You've hit on a common objection to rule consequentialism.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
The pushback.
Yeah, critics say it's incoherent to endorse actions that, are less than ideal if your ultimate goal is to maximize good.
Yeah, that does seem a little counterintuitive, right?
It does.
So like we're all about getting the best results,
Right.
but sometimes we're okay with getting slightly worse results.
That's the critique. But rule consequentialists have a response. They argue that they're not committed to maximizing good in every single isolated action.
Okay.
It's about creating a system,
Okay.
a framework that overall leads to the most good, even if it means accepting some less than ideal outcomes along the way.
So it's like a long-term investment. Sometimes you have to take a small loss
Exactly.
to get a bigger gain later.
Exactly.
Got it.
It's about the big picture, the overall good that comes from having a stable, predictable moral code.
Right, because if you're constantly like tweaking and changing based on the whims of the moment,
Right.
then there's no, like, stable foundation.
No stability, exactly.
Okay, so it's about consistency as well.
Yeah, and it's also about kind of building trust, right? Like,
Yeah.
if people know that everyone's generally going to follow the rules, then they can cooperate more effectively.
That makes sense. Okay, I'm getting this, but hold on. I just thought of something else.
Right.
We keep talking about rules, but there are different types of rules, right?
Right.
Like, are we talking about strict, unbreakable rules, or are there exceptions?
That's a great question.
And how do we decide which rules are the best ones?
Right.
The ones that will actually lead to the most good. These are making my head spin a little bit.
Those are great questions, and they lead us to some of the most interesting and challenging aspects of rule consequentialism.
Okay.
But before we dive into those depths,
Okay.
let's take a moment to think about the different ways that rule consequentialism itself can be formulated.
Okay, so we're going even deeper.
We're going deeper.
All right, I'm ready.
So one crucial distinction is between full and partial rule consequentialism.
Full versus partial, what's the difference?
So full rule consequentialism uses rules to determine not only how we should make decisions,
Okay.
but also what makes an act morally right or wrong.
Okay.
So in this view, an action is wrong because it violates a rule that has been determined to lead to the best overall consequences,
Okay.
even if, in that specific case, breaking the rule might have produced a slightly better outcome.
So even if, like, by some crazy coincidence breaking a rule, that's generally good, leads to, like, the best possible outcome in this one weird situation.
Right.
A full rule consequentialist would still say you shouldn't have done that.
That's right.
Wow. It's strict.
It is about sticking to the principle even when it's hard.
Right.
Because for full rule consequentialists, moral rightness is tied to following these rules
Okay.
that generally produce the best consequences.
Okay, so it's about the long term.
It's about the long term.
Consistency of the system.
Exactly.
Okay. I see the logic there, but it does seem a little rigid.
It does.
What about those cases where following the rule could actually lead to, like, a disaster?
Right.
What if I have to lie to protect someone from being hurt?
Right.
Would a full rule consequentialist really say that lying is always wrong, even in that situation?
That's where you get the rule worship objection.
Okay.
Critics say that full rule consequentialism can lead to these kind of absurd or even harmful outcomes.
Yeah, because it's forcing people to just blindly follow rules,
Blindly follow rules.
even when it seems obvious that that's not the right thing to do.
Exactly.
Okay, so is there a way to avoid this rule worship problem
Right.
while still kind of keeping the basic idea of rule consequentialism?
That's where partial rule consequentialism comes in,
Okay.
which offers a bit more flexibility.
Okay. How so?
Well, partial rule consequentialists might say that we should use rules to guide our decisions generally,
Okay.
but ultimately we judge actions right or wrong based on their individual consequences.
Okay.
So they might admit that in some rare cases, breaking a generally good rule
Right.
could be justified
If it leads to a much better outcome.
if it leads to a much better outcome.
Okay, so it's like rules are important,
Yeah.
but we also need to be able to use our judgment
Yes.
to look at the specific situation and say, okay, maybe this time we need to bend the rules a little bit.
Exactly.
Yep.
Partial rule consequentialism is trying to find a balance between the consistency of rules and the flexibility to respond to these unique or unpredictable situations.
So it's recognizing that rules are meant to be helpful guidelines, not like these rigid things that you can never break no matter what.
That's right.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It seems like partial rule consequentialism avoids that rule worship problem,
Right.
but it still says, okay, rules are important.
Rules are important.
Let's try to follow them.
Right.
But I'm still wondering about something. How do we actually decide which rules are the best ones?
Yeah.
The ones that will actually lead to the most good? And is it even possible
Right.
to create a set of rules that's going to work well in every situation?
Those are great questions, and they're exactly the kinds of challenges that philosophers are grappling with when they're thinking about rule consequentialism.
Right, because it's a really complex theory with a lot of moving parts.
It is.
But I feel like we've laid a really solid foundation.
I think so too.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground already, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
We've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore.
There's so much more to explore.
Yeah, and that's what makes this deep dive so exciting.
I know, I'm excited.
We're about to get into the really thorny issues, the objections and criticisms that have been leveled against rule consequentialism. Are you ready to see how this theory holds up?
I'm ready for the challenge. Let's do it.
So one of the most common criticisms of rule consequentialism is something called the collapse objection.
Okay, collapse. That sounds a little intense.
Yeah, it is. It's basically the worry that if you push rule consequentialism too far, it kind of collapses back into act consequentialism.
Okay, so it kind of like undoes itself.
In a way, yeah, the critics are saying, look, if you're constantly tweaking the rules to try to maximize good in every settled situation,
Right.
aren't you basically just judging each action individually anyway? What's the point of even having rules at that point?
Right. It becomes so specific
Exactly.
that it loses its usefulness as a rule.
It's like imagine trying to follow a recipe that has like 1,000 footnotes and exceptions.
Oh my
You'd
God.
never get anything cooked.
Yeah, it would be impossible, right?
Right.
So how do rule consequentialists respond to that?
Well, remember we talked about how the best kind of rule consequentialism focuses on the good that comes from teaching and accepting rules, not just blindly complying with them.
Right. So it's
Yeah.
not just about doing what the rule says.
Right.
It's about understanding why the rule is there.
Exactly. It's about internalizing the rule.
Right.
So rule consequentialists would say that having overly complicated rules with a ton of exceptions
Right.
would actually defeat the whole purpose. It would make the rules confusing and hard to follow.
Right. It's like if you were trying to learn a language
Right.
and there was a grammar rule for every single possible sentence.
Exactly. Your head would explode.
Yeah.
Right. So even if a more complex rule could technically lead to a slightly better outcome in some cases, they argue that the overall benefit of having a simpler, easier to understand rule outweighs those potential gains.
Okay. So it's about finding that sweet spot
Yeah.
between like super detailed rules and then just having no rules at all. Okay, but doesn't this create another problem? If we're sticking to these simpler rules, doesn't that mean we're going to end up sometimes doing things that don't actually maximize the good? And
Yeah.
wouldn't that be kind of like against the whole point of consequentialism?
That's a really good point, and that's the essence of the incoherence objection.
Okay.
Critics say that it just doesn't make sense for a consequentialist theory to endorse suboptimal outcomes. They see it as a kind of logical contradiction.
Yeah, I mean, on the surface, it does seem kind of strange, right?
It
A
does.
theory that's all about maximizing good.
Right.
But sometimes it's okay with not getting the absolute best outcome.
Exactly, and that's a critique. But again, rule consequentialists have a response.
Okay, let's hear.
They say that they're not actually committed to maximizing good in every single action.
Okay.
Their commitment is to creating a system
Right?
that overall produces the best outcomes.
Right, so it's a more holistic view,
It is a more holistic view.
not just focused on like that one specific situation.
Exactly. So they're willing to accept a few suboptimal outcomes along the way if it means that the overall system is more stable and reliable.
Okay, so would you rather live in a world
Right.
where everyone is constantly trying to calculate the best possible thing to do,
Right.
which sounds kind of chaotic to me,
It does.
or a world where people are generally following the rules, even if it means sometimes things aren't perfect?
Right. And that's the gamble that rule consequentialism is making.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'd rather have a little bit of predictability,
Yeah.
even if it means sometimes things aren't completely optimized.
Right.
But okay, this brings up another issue. What about those situations where following the rules could actually lead to a really bad outcome?
Right.
Like what if you have to break a promise to save someone's life?
That's a great point. And that gets to heart of the rule worship objection.
Okay.
Critics say that rule consequentialism is too rigid.
Okay.
It doesn't allow for those exceptional situations where breaking the rules is clearly the right thing to do.
Right? Because it seems like it would turn people into mindless rule followers
Right.
who are just incapable of like making judgments
Right.
about, okay, well, maybe in this case I need to break the rule.
Exactly. And that's the worry. But of course, rule consequentialists don't think we should just blindly follow rules
Right.
no matter what.
Especially if it's going to cause harm.
Right. Exactly.
So how do they deal with that?
Well, they would say that a good set of moral rules should include rules that are flexible enough to accommodate those exceptional situations.
So like a rule for when to break the rules.
Right. It's about recognizing that some rules are more fundamental than others.
Okay.
So, for example, a rule consequentialist might say that the rule don't cause harm is more important than the rule always keep your promises.
Okay, so it's like there's a hierarchy
There's a hierarchy of rules.
of rules.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if you have to break a promise to prevent someone from being harmed, you're actually upholding a higher level rule.
Okay, so it's not just about blindly following whatever rule is in front of you.
Right.
It's about understanding that there's this bigger picture.
Exactly. It's like having a fire alarm system.
Okay.
You want it to be sensitive enough to alert you to any potential danger,
Right.
but you also want it to be smart enough to distinguish between a real fire
Right.
and someone just burning toast.
Right. You don't want to be calling the fire department every time you make breakfast.
Exactly.
Okay.
So rule consequentialism is about finding that sweet spot
Yeah.
between consistency and flexibility,
Okay.
between having clear rules to guide our actions, but also having the wisdom to know when to make exceptions.
I like that a lot. But okay, even with that flexibility, some critics say that rule consequentialism faces another problem. It makes morality too dependent on things like human nature, or like how many resources are available, or even like the size of the population. Okay, wait, what do those things have to do with morality?
So the objection is that for rule consequentialism, the justification for a moral rule depends on certain facts about the world.
Okay.
But critics say that some moral rules should just be absolute and universal no matter what.
Okay, so it's like saying don't steal is only a good rule if people care about owning stuff.
Yeah.
And there's not enough stuff to go around for everyone.
Exactly.
But what if we lived in a world where everyone could have anything they wanted?
Right.
Would stealing suddenly become okay?
That's the kind of question these critics are asking.
Yeah.
They're using these thought experiments to challenge rule consequentialism.
Right.
They're saying that some things just seem wrong,
Right.
regardless of the situation or the potential consequences.
Okay, yeah, that's a really interesting point.
It is.
So it kind of gets to the heart of this question of, is morality something that we discover
Right.
based on how the world works?
Right.
Or is it something that exists independently of us, like a universal truth?
Exactly. It's a really deep philosophical question,
It is.
and it kind of takes us to the edge of what rule consequentialism can tell us about morality.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here with these objections to rule consequentialism,
We have.
but I feel like there's still more to explore.
Absolutely. There's always more to explore.
I'm ready for it. Let's keep going.
All right, so remember how we were talking about the importance of teaching and internalizing moral rules?
Right, like it's not enough to just follow the rules because you're afraid of getting punished.
Exactly. You
Right.
want people to actually understand the rules and believe in them.
Right, it's about really buying into the moral code.
Exactly. But that raises a really interesting question. Who does the teaching?
Oh, okay, I see what you mean.
If we're trying to create a rule consequentialist society where everyone embraces these ideal rules, who's responsible for passing those rules down to each generation?
Right, because if the teachers are the ones who are supposed to instill these values in their students,
Right.
but the teachers themselves haven't fully internalized the ideal code,
Exactly.
and they're going to pass on some of their own biases and imperfections to the next generation.
Exactly. It's like if you're trying to copy a masterpiece painting,
Okay.
but your hand is shaky.
Oh, like that.
The basic composition might be there.
Right.
But there are going to be some distortions.
Right. It's never going to be a perfect replica.
Exactly. And that kind of highlights a potential challenge for rule consequentialism.
Okay.
Is it even possible to achieve a truly ideal moral code, one that's perfectly consistent and impartial and, perfectly in line with maximizing good?
Right. Or are we always going to be stuck with some degree of imperfection?
That's the question. Are we always going to be limited by our own human flaws?
So you're suggesting that moral perfection is just like an unattainable ideal?
In a way, yes. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about rule consequentialism.
Okay.
It doesn't pretend to have all the answers.
Okay.
It recognizes that the real world is messy.
Right. People aren't perfect.
People aren't perfect.
And so moral systems are probably not going to be perfect either.
Exactly. It's not about finding a perfect solution.
Okay.
It's about striving for the best possible outcome.
Right.
Knowing that we're never going to eliminate all moral error or achieve some utopian state of perfect harmony.
So it's a journey, not a destination.
I like a journey, not a destination.
Yeah, we're always learning and adapting
Exactly.
and trying to improve our understanding of morality.
Exactly. And I think that's something we can all agree on,
Yeah.
regardless of our specific philosophical beliefs.
Right, like this idea that we should always be striving to be better.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole discussion so fascinating, right? It's this ongoing process of thinking critically about our values,
Yes.
testing them against the real world, and being open to changing our minds when we need to.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that morality is complex.
It is complex.
And there are going to be trade-offs.
Absolutely.
And we're not always going to get everything right.
That's right.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Absolutely not.
Well said. So, listener, as we wrap up this deep dive into rule consequentialism, we want to leave you with this question. How do you think we should navigate this tension between rules and consequences in our own lives? What are the principles that you're willing to stick to, even if it means sacrificing something in the short term? And how do you balance the pursuit of a good life with the reality that none of us are perfect? Keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper into a world of ideas.
Until next time.